Lisa,
Yes, baby girl.
when I grow up, I want to be a womenace to society.
Then so shall you be. Hey, this is Lisa Landry. Welcome back to One Menace to Society. Y'all, I'm so excited today to speak with my sister in Oklahoma. Welcome back to the podcast, Miss Summer Wesley.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
I want to thank you for joining us on the 4th of July. The 4th of July is the birth of this nation, according to, what you find online.
Right.
I'm quoting from Wiki. This is a federal holiday commemorating the adoption of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. So the people decided to ratify this legislation saying that we are a nation, right? It's the birth of a nation.
Right.
What does that mean to you, though? Because your people were already here. It was already a nation inhabited by folk.
Not only that document, the Declaration of Independence, actually refers to us, the many nations that were here prior to invasion, as merciless Indian savages. So that's really fun.
Is that your Tinder profile?
It should, if I ever go back on Tinder, I should do that. Because it did say Indigenous, but I think changing it to Merciless Indian Savage would be much better. Just let them know what they're getting right up front.
Yeah.
So yes, 4th of July is kind of an interesting one, and there's never an end to the debates in Indian country because we have, some segments of our communities that are super American and assimilated, and then we have more traditional people who consider ourselves part of our nation first and may or may not even consider themselves to be American. It can be kind of a tense and ironic time. For the most part, my family in particular, we just ignore the Declaration of Independence connection and just like to blow shit up with the fireworks, but that's fine. But,
I was going to ask, what do y'all do? Do you have a family gathering where you hang white folk in effigy and then shoot some fireworks? It's not like you can speak for every Indigenous person in America, just like I can't speak for every white woman. So, we're just having a conversation. But I do wonder, what is it like for the average Indigenous person on the 4th of July? I'm sure it's a bittersweet thing because many people do identify as American, and yet you also have this cultural and Indigenous history.
It's very complex because on the one hand, those of us who are contemporary, we grew up in this colonized environment with the occupying government that's here, so we identify with the American experience in some ways, but then yet the holiday itself is also a reminder of they're literally celebrating the genocide of our people.
Yeah.
So it's a constant tension back and forth and trying to figure out how you feel about that and what can be done about that, because especially those of us who are working to improve the conditions of our communities, most of us eventually come to the conclusion that we can't actually heal our communities while still being under oppression of an occupying government. So where does that leave us? And at this juncture, I think it leaves us more questions than answers, but it is a complex emotional and intellectual quandary.
No doubt.
I do like the idea of hanging people in effigy, especially if I get to burn it, by the way, just for fun. I've never tried it, but
Bottle rockets ready.
Are wonderful.
There is a lot happening, though, with the Supreme Court. When you and I last spoke, Patrick Murphy was convicted of killing his girlfriend's ex-boyfriend, George Jacobs. And he did this on reservation territory, yes?
It was part of the original Muskogee Creek Reservation, but it's no longer trust land. So the idea at the time that gave the state the thought that they could prosecute was because it's not trust land, which is a restricted legal status of particular land that only gives the criminal jurisdiction in that situation to the tribe in a limited form and to the federal government. But since that's not trust land, the state believed they had the right to prosecute. They prosecuted. He was convicted and given a death sentence. On the appeal of his death sentence, the argument was put forth that the reservation, as it was established in the treaty, had never been diminished. So that's the operative legal term that's used, which means reduced or changed in the subsequent treaties or by act of Congress, because they can be diminished by act of Congress as well. In the case of the Creek Nation, the federal court decided that none of those subsequent laws ever actually diminished the original treaty boundaries. Therefore, it was considered Indian country under the definition within the Major Crimes Act, so that any crime committed within the bounds of the Major Crime Act would then not be within state jurisdiction.
Which means this is federal, right? So the state did not have a legal right.
Right. They could not prosecute him for that because it was a native offender and a native victim. Now, of course, most of us were very happy with the federal court's decision to uphold tribal sovereignty and say that the boundaries had not been diminished, particularly because many of our tribes have very similar treaty language. And so that would mean that we still have a lot broader jurisdiction than we have previously been allowed over our own people. However, I am not particularly excited about the Supreme Court taking this case, because if they had rejected certiorari, then the lower court's ruling would have stood, and the Murphy ruling would have set precedent to where the tribe had that jurisdiction. I cynically anticipate the Supreme Court to find some way to limit this or to reverse it entirely, especially given the other rulings of the court as far as Indian country in recent months. And now that Justice Kennedy is retiring during July, a replacement by the Trump administration is a terrifying thought for Indian country. I don't know how it's going to turn out. I did notice in the Murphy ruling that the federal court was very careful in how they crafted their ruling to try to make it limited. So some people are holding out hope that that means that the Supreme Court will go ahead and uphold it, since it is such a limited ruling and effect that it would have, because it was very clear it's only the Major Crimes Act, only with this type of language and no diminishment language. So it's kind of a tense time wondering how that ruling is going to come out and what the effect is going to be on Indian country, because there is a push against tribal sovereignty. Trump continually makes statements against our governments, so it's hard not to get a bleak attitude about it sometimes. So it's kind of a tense time.
Because there's a lot that's going to be decided in this. It's not just about this one murder conviction. It's about actual land that is being utilized now, as best as I know, by oil companies and gas companies.
Right. Now, this ruling, if they upheld it, most likely wouldn't affect anything to do with land use or oil companies. It's only within the Major Crimes Act, which is violent felonies, essentially. The lower court was very careful to limit it to that. But it would change the landscape on how we are able to protect our people and if we aren't. Tribes are essentially not able to protect our own people in many ways. I know VAWA was very celebrated, the Violence Against Women's Act, because finally some tribes in particular circumstances, which are very limited, are able to prosecute for domestic violence. But even that's very limited. And the prosecutorial rate of the feds in Indian country is extremely low. If it's drug trafficking, they might prosecute it. If it's violence against our people, it's I think the last statistics I looked at, which I probably should be careful saying this, but I think it was around a third for prosecutions. It's very low.
Wow.
Even though tribes can only sentence criminals to 3 years in prison, we can't go any higher than that. There's a hope that if we're able to start prosecuting more, even at that low end of the spectrum, or with our peacekeeping courts or something of that nature, that maybe we can make a difference, whereas state and federal aren't doing what's needed to actually change the statistics of violence in our communities. So
what ways would they go about fixing that? Because I know that you're very involved in all of these aspects of...
Right. Well, I mean, it's different for each tribe. Some have programs that I think are very promising. I tend to prefer their court systems that are set up more in culturally appropriate ways, integrating that given community cultural teachings and things of that nature. Peacemaking courts, which focus on making victims whole and also reducing recidivism, actual rehabilitation focuses rather than just punitive. We have other tribes who have basically just modeled their court systems after state court systems, and I tend to think they have about the same level of effectiveness as state courts, which is not much at all, which is actually, I am not licensed by a state, and I have an ongoing argument with an attorney that I work with because he wants me to get licensed and I'm refusing because I don't like state courts. I don't believe in the system. I don't believe it's working, and I think my advocacy and community work has a bigger effect. So I prefer to invest my time there. So I think it just depends on the communities, but I do hope to see a push towards more traditional ways in whatever that looks like in each community, because, you know, we're talking hundreds of distinct cultures, and I do think we need, in the state and federal courts as well, we need reform. We need to stop with for-profit prisons, and we've got to start focusing on people. You know, humans aren't expendable, and, you know, healing communities and looking at rehabilitation and prevention efforts is something that I've been looking into a lot more lately. I think we're putting Band-Aids on arterial bleeds.
Yes, I agree.
When we need to be working on actually addressing foundational problems.
I completely agree with you. There does seem to be a shift toward prison reform now. It seems to be a bipartisan issue. There's a lot of people speaking out about the ridiculousness of mandatory minimums and kids who commit crimes and they're sentenced as adults. And nonviolent drug offenders are spending lives in prisons.
Right.
Yeah.
I personally take issue with incarceration for any nonviolent crime. I know the arguments are that there are no nonviolent crimes, but having worked with that population, I vehemently agree, and I don't think it actually serves anyone other than the people who are making money off of this prison and prison labor. I don't think it's serving anybody else. Why so many people continue to support that, I don't understand, other than there's an empathy gap and they don't view these inmates as people. The empathy gap is a phrase I've been using a lot lately because I've been kind of evaluating that, and a lot of the work I do, I see it a lot in prison and in social and in like the child welfare system. There's a lot of people who are just very quick to just take those kids and throw the family away. And with the homelessness, you know, there's a lot of people who are very callous about the homeless population. And I've been struggling a lot with myself and trying to understand how people can be so callous about human lives and not understand, like, you really don't see them as people, do you? Which is something we already knew with, you know, regards to like racism and things like that. But I guess I'm really seeing it a lot in other areas of social justice lately. And thank God we just passed medical marijuana, because I might need it if they can.
Yeah, you should have PTSD. You're a mom. I would reckon you'll get qualified.
I actually do have PTSD, but I don't know if that's going to be one of the qualified PTSD and related anxiety and depression. But I don't know if that's going to be on the list of qualifying diagnoses or not. They're still trying to work that out. So
yeah, I understand your governor's having a bit of a time with this passage.
To call a special session to add restrictions to it if she's not happy with what the health officials come up with as far as regulatory frameworks. So that's going to be interesting.
Well, isn't she gone in November? I mean,
yes,
how much can she really do?
Right. She's termed out. So we will have a new governor elected in November. I'm a little concerned about that race to see what it looks like. As far as I'm concerned, the Republican option is essentially a lateral move, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But I don't know what we're looking at as far as the odds of electing the Democratic nominee. So we will just have to see. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a lot of feverish campaigning happening between now and then, because I don't know how this state can take 4 more years like it's been for the last several.
Well, I read about one good thing that happened. I don't know if you're familiar with this or not, but the Supreme Court has decided that a major Indian case, you know, the Salmon situation for the tribes in Washington and the Pacific Northwest?
Yes.
About whether or not the state of Washington has a responsibility to allow salmon to be fished and making sure that there is viable salmon resources available to the indigenous folk in that region. And the Supreme Court, and it goes back to Justice Kennedy, he had to recuse himself because he was involved with the 10th Circuit, which is the circuit that decided that Washington does have a responsibility to make sure that indigenous people can fish salmon and it's available. Uh-huh. So Kennedy is very wily. Like, he's just blowing stuff up in all directions because he could not vote. The Supreme Court has decided that must stay in effect. And this also has a great reverberating effect, doesn't it, for indigenous people, or no?
At this point, it's hard to tell. I have not read the full opinion. I'm just synopses. It was a win for the tribe. How far reaching the effect is going to be is going to be determined later as people start citing this case and seeing how much sway and how courts start to give it and how broad they're willing to apply it. We're hopeful that that's going to be a good thing, but I mean, there are sometimes cases that courts do backflips to differentiate from. It's not as big a win as if the Supreme Court had taken it and upheld the ruling, but it is a baby step. And I am glad that they refused cert on it because, like I said, I'm always afraid when they accept cert on anything that the tribe has actually won on at the lower court. Mm-hmm. Because my suspicion is always that it's going to turn out like the Baby Veronica case where they just take it so that they can make things up in order to reverse it. So it is a win. Now, as far as the scope of what it's going to mean for Indian country, that's still going to be played out, but we'll see how that goes. I'm sure it probably won't take long before the case is cited and actually tried to be applied, and we'll see how that works out.
So you're hopeful but pragmatic.
Always, because you never know. I mean, the reality is we talk about being sovereigns and all of this, but the reality is with the stroke of a pen, the Supreme Court or Congress could do away with their recognition of our sovereignty, whole cloth. So I think we always have to be cautious, and I think we have to be careful even when what we decide to litigate up the chain to them. Because we talk about being sovereigns, but there's a difference in inherent sovereignty, which is our right as human beings to rule ourselves, and recognized sovereignty, which is the amount of deference that their government is going to give to ours. And at any point in time, they could literally decide not to care what we have to say anymore. So we try to be cautious and strategic in all of these things as we go through.
Well, when you've been beaten down, removed from your lands, and genocided, I would imagine that you have a bit of a we'll wait and see policy.
Cautious.
Yeah.
There's that whole thing. We don't really want to die, so.
Can't we all just get along and may I fish, please, in peace?
Right. Please just let me fish and let us have our dances without killing us for it. I mean, that's so much to ask.
Recently, Laura Ingalls Wilder was stripped from her own namesake of an award.
Right.
Basically, because she had used some extremely insensitive and racist language in her writings, which, I mean, it was like over 100 years ago. I'm not giving her a pass. I'm not saying it's right. I'm wondering if they can strip her of that award because I think a line in one of her books, and I read those books. I loved those books when I was a kid. And of course, I didn't pick up on that language as a kid because you're a kid. But she said that there was nobody living there, no people living there, just Indians or something to that effect in one of her books.
Right.
And because she's been stripped posthumously of this title, this special award, do you think that we will ever revisit these documents that are in our Library of Congress and where your people are called savages, strike that? Like if we're going back, really? I mean, because like think about it, we're taking down.
That's a question we ask a lot. I don't see it happening in my lifetime. We're working on this in reverse right now. We're doing it with things like recognizing the language in her books, for example, and kind of working on the pop culture level to get people to understand that we are human and we are alive and we're still here. Basically we have to convince the colonial population of our humanity, which is an interesting thing to think about. But I don't know, maybe if that effort is successful on a large scale after a few generations, maybe eventually, I don't know. I don't know that it's...
We probably never will, right? I mean, she was just a chick,
I don't
too.
see why we would, because a capitalist society is always built on human capital. People are always currency or property. So I feel like no capitalist-based society is ever going to actually acknowledge or recognize the importance of doing that. So I don't know why it would ever actually come up to a move to make it actually happen. I mean, it's a nice thought, but I don't know that utopia will ever exist.
It just seems like we're picking and choosing. I don't want to say like as a white culture, but I want to say as an American society, as a people who are becoming more sensitive to the needs of everybody living within this land. Like, it doesn't have to be about labels or whatever, but just the fact that this is not cool. This wording is not okay. And because words like this were accepted as normal and people being called non-people was part of our fabric as a nation,
And it still is in a lot of ways, which is why there's this concerted effort to make these changes. I've not worked, like, say, in literature on this issue, but, I do work in the mascots issue and things like that. And so this language is actually very common still. And that's the actual reason that we work on these issues and changing these subtle things that are normalized to us, because it's about helping people understand and future generations to be more accepting and understand the humanity of all people and appreciating diversity. So there is a lot of picking and choosing that happens, because the populations and the demographics of whatever area you're talking about, sometimes you can make progress and sometimes you can't. I know in some areas that I've worked in, like, say, Indigenous Peoples Day, right? We've talked about working on that. Norman, it passed the first year it was introduced. No problem, no resistance, no votes. In Oklahoma City, which is just up the road, and actually a more diverse, a larger Native population than Norman per capita, I believe, we were met with some
major
disdain
resistance
from the council.
Sexism.
The public right. The
Yeah.
public was very supportive, but the council themselves were not, and they rejected it several years in a row. It still hasn't passed. In working on the mascot issue, we've all gotten threats. There are people who have been stalked and doxxed just for saying, hey, could you not recreate the scalping of our people at your sporting events and things like that.
Just common decency would dictate you probably shouldn't do that.
You would think, but common human decency isn't that common. So sometimes we say it out loud because we feel the need to, and then we get very angry responses. So I don't know. I think the hope is that if a trend happens to start changing these things and to stop using slurs and things of that nature, that maybe as future generations come up and it's less normalized to them, that things can change. It's kind of a long range goal. But I think we see that push has been happening in the African American community. They kind of started at the same time, but of course there was a larger scale, and we still see how much pushback and regression that they get on their issues as well. And, I have a lot of allies that I work with in that community as well, that they also get some death threats, simply for saying Black Lives Matter, so I think the hope is always there that change will happen over time, but it's going to take a long time.
Well, it seems that the generations coming up now are more sensitive about
I think so.
the pain inflicted, Yeah, because, we've all inherited this big mess, this big, beautiful thing that we got popping, this life in America. So if we don't come together and heal it, who's going to? What would be the biggest change that would make you happy? As an Indigenous professional woman and a mama, what would be the one big thing that could happen tomorrow where you're like, hey, we're on the right track?
Oh, wow.
Only one. Only one.
Only one? Everything that comes to mind will get the feds knocking on my door by tomorrow morning, and I don't know if I should say those out loud.
Do you want to just speak in code? Do you want to just tap it out?
We'll have some code talking right here on the podcast. Anything, whether it's actually feasibly possible or not.
Yes, it's your big ticket wish item.
I would like people to just get some more empathy and start evaluating people as humans. I think that's the underlying answer to progress on all of these fronts. We're going to be less violent with people if we see them as people. If we see their lives as valuable, we're going to be less likely to be willing to throw them away or treat them badly. Hopefully we can raise these younger generations up to have that and to think these things through. Like you said, we are seeing these younger generations are better in that way than we are. If we could give them some proper mental health services so that they're not as crazy as some of us are.
Yeah.
From living in all of this, trauma-inducing mess, then that would be great too. Proper health care doesn't seem like that big a deal, but apparently it is.
Yeah, proper health, mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, all that stuff. I like your vision.
Oh, thank you.
And I like you. And I'm really glad that you came and spoke with me today, and I'm appreciative.
I appreciate you having me on. It's always good.
Summer, how can we all keep up with you?
But you can go to my website, which is summerwesley.com. It's SUMMERWESLEY. And my social media links are on there. You can follow me. I share my work, but more importantly, I signal boost the work of lots of others in other social justice circles so that people can stay aware of what's going on and how they can help. And I also do public speaking and refer those out to other people as well so that we can raise awareness for issues and, make change where we can.
I want to wish you a happy 4th of July, but I don't want to be insensitive, so I hope you have a blessed day.
You as well, and I hope you get to, play with some small explosives for the holiday. It'd be great.
I do that every day, girl. I got a lighter.
That's the best way to be.
Thanks again, Summer Wesley, and thanks y'all for listening. And to celebrate today, 4th of July, may we all rise from any oppression and tyranny to complete freedom. Please join me at lisalandry.com. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you do that, you'll know when each new podcast drops every Womenace Wednesday. And you can also sign up for my newsletter. At lisalandry.com, you will receive a free audio download of my comedy. Shout out, Ari. I wish I was with you today, little man, but if you're out at a picnic or on the water and you got a bottle rocket in your hand, let it go. And use a bottle next time. That's what they're there for, son.